Somalia tops African deportation list as U.S. revives crackdown. Welcome to the Bold African Voice, BAV, where we tackle the most pressing issues facing Africa and the global community today. I'm Abdul Karim Kargbo, born and raised in Africa. In this video, we dive deep into the recent U.S. crackdown on African immigrants, with Somalia topping the deportation list. Stick with us as we unpack the latest developments, provide critical analysis, and explore what this means for the future of U.S. Africa relations. In January 2025, the United States intensified its immigration enforcement under President Donald Trump's administration, with a notable focus on African nationals. Somalia emerged at the top of the deportation list, with 490 of its citizens identified for removal. Other African nations significantly affected include Nigeria, 390, Ghana, 3228, and Kenya, 1282. Additional countries such as Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, and Zambia also have substantial numbers of citizens facing deportation. Critical analysis of the deportation policy. The Trump administration's renewed emphasis on deportations marks a significant shift from the previous administration's policies. The decision to prioritize the removal of individuals from specific African countries raises several concerns. Humanitarian impact. Many deportees have established lives in the U.S., with families and employment. Deportation often leads to family separations and can expose individuals to dangers in their home countries, especially those who fled conflict or persecution. Economic consequences. African immigrants contribute to various sectors of the U.S. economy, including healthcare, education, and technology. Mass deportations could result in labor shortages and disrupt essential services. Legal and diplomatic challenges. The U.S. must negotiate with other nations to accept deportees, which can strain diplomatic relations. Some countries have expressed reluctance to accept deportees, complicating the logistics of mass deportations. Africa-wide comparison. The deportation figures highlight the disproportionate impact on certain African countries. For instance, Somalia, with a population of approximately 15 million, has 4,090 citizens on the deportation list, representing about 0.27% of its population. In contrast, Nigeria, with a population exceeding 200 million, has 3,690 individuals identified for deportation, accounting for approximately 0.18% of its population. This disparity suggests that factors such as the size of the diaspora, immigration patterns, and bilateral relations with the U.S. influence deportation numbers. Forward-looking approach. As the U.S. continues its immigration enforcement, several considerations emerge. Policy revisions. Future administrations may reassess the humanitarian and economic impacts of mass deportations, potentially leading to policy adjustments that balance enforcement with compassion. International cooperation. Enhanced collaboration between the U.S. and African nations could facilitate the safe and dignified return of deportees, including support for reintegration programs. Community support. Local communities and advocacy groups play a crucial role in supporting immigrants and influencing policy decisions through activism and public discourse. Latest developments. In recent weeks, the Trump administration has implemented several significant changes to U.S. immigration policy. Increased arrests. Immigration officers are now making a daily average of 710 arrests, a substantial increase from the previous administration. Policy reversals. The administration has ended policies that previously limited immigration arrests near sensitive locations such as schools and hospitals. International tensions. Diplomatic relations have been tested as some countries have resisted accepting deportees, leading to threats of tariffs and other measures. These developments underscore the complex interplay between domestic policy objectives and international relations in the realm of immigration enforcement. Impact on Africa's diplomatic relations with the U.S. As the U.S. continues its aggressive deportation strategy, diplomatic relations between African countries and the U.S. have become increasingly strained. Several African nations have expressed concern over the impact of deportations on their citizens, particularly those who have established lives in the U.S. These tensions are exacerbated by the challenges African governments face in providing adequate reintegration programs for deported individuals. For instance, Somali authorities have raised concerns about the safety of their nationals being deported from the U.S. Many Somalis who sought refuge in the U.S. fled the ongoing conflict and instability in their home country, and their forced return could expose them to heightened risks, particularly in regions controlled by militant groups like al-Shabaab. Considering these circumstances, Somali officials have called on the U.S. government to reconsider its policies and explore alternative solutions that would safeguard the well-being of their citizens. Similarly, Nigerian authorities have voiced their displeasure with the large number of Nigerians on the deportation list. With a significant diaspora community in the U.S., many Nigerians who have lived in the country for years contribute to various sectors of the U.S. economy. The sudden deportation of such a large group has led to fears of potential economic and social disruption in both the U.S. and Nigeria. Nigerian diplomats have sought to engage with the U.S. government on this issue, emphasizing the importance of bilateral cooperation on immigration matters. African immigrants and the U.S. economy. While the deportation crackdown may be framed as a means of strengthening national security, it also raises significant questions about the role of African immigrants in the U.S. economy. Immigrants from African countries have played a vital role in various industries, from healthcare and education to technology and finance. Many African nationals have filled essential roles in sectors experiencing labor shortages, such as healthcare, where they contribute as doctors, nurses, and caregivers. The removal of such a large group of immigrants could exacerbate these shortages, potentially leading to decreased productivity and a strain on public services. In addition, African immigrants often fill jobs that are less attractive to native-born U.S. citizens, contributing to economic growth in areas that would otherwise face a lack of skilled labor. For instance, a 2024 report from the Migration Policy Institute highlighted that African immigrants are disproportionately represented in key industries such as healthcare and technology, which have been crucial in the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. Their sudden removal could result in setbacks in these sectors, further straining the U.S. healthcare system and delaying recovery efforts. Potential policy reforms and future prospects. As the Trump administration's aggressive immigration policy continues to unfold, there are several possible avenues for future policy reforms that could alleviate some of the humanitarian and economic pressures. One such avenue is the expansion of Temporary Protected Status, TPS, which allows nationals from countries facing ongoing conflict or natural disasters to live and work in the U.S. temporarily. This option could be particularly beneficial for Somali nationals, many of whom fled their home country due to the civil war and terrorist activities. The U.S. Congress could also take action to create pathways to citizenship for certain groups of immigrants who have lived in the U.S. for extended periods, worked legally, and contributed to the economy. Programs like the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, DACA, have shown that even in a restrictive immigration environment, there is potential for bipartisan support to create more humane solutions for certain immigrant populations. Additionally, African governments could strengthen their diplomatic efforts to encourage more collaboration with the U.S. on immigration issues. By promoting dialogue and seeking mutually beneficial agreements on deportations and reintegration, African countries could better manage the challenges posed by U.S. immigration policies while ensuring the protection of their citizens. African nations' internal responses to deportations. While diplomatic engagement with the U.S. remains essential, African nations are also taking steps to address the deportations of their citizens internally. For some countries, particularly those in East and West Africa, the issue of deportation is intertwined with broader socio-economic challenges, such as high unemployment rates and political instability. The reintegration of deported individuals can place additional strain on already struggling communities. To address these challenges, some African governments have begun to implement programs aimed at supporting deportees upon their return. These programs include vocational training, job placement assistance, and mental health support to help deportees reintegrate into their communities. However, these efforts have been hampered by limited resources and the sheer scale of deportations, leaving many deportees to face an uncertain future. For instance, the Somali government has worked with international organizations to provide reintegration support for deported nationals, including assistance with housing and employment. However, these programs have been criticized for being underfunded and lacking the infrastructure to support large numbers of returnees effectively. Similarly, Nigeria has launched programs aimed at reintegrating deported citizens, but these initiatives have faced challenges in terms of funding and scalability. The role of international organizations. International organizations, such as the United Nations and the International Organization for Migration, IOM, have also played a crucial role in advocating for the rights of deported individuals and facilitating reintegration efforts. These organizations have called on the U.S. government to adopt more humane deportation policies, particularly for individuals who face persecution or hardship upon their return. The IOM has been actively involved in supporting African governments in their efforts to reintegrate deported individuals. In collaboration with national governments, the IOM has provided technical assistance and funding for reintegration programs, with a particular focus on economic empowerment and social reintegration. However, the scale of the deportations and the political climate in the U.S. present significant challenges for international organizations. As the U.S. continues its crackdown on illegal immigration, the need for stronger cooperation between African countries, international organizations, and the U.S. government has never been more urgent. Prospects for the future. The renewed focus on deportations under the Trump administration is reshaping the landscape of immigration policy in the U.S. and has far-reaching consequences for African nations and their citizens. While African governments are pushing for more humane policies and better support for deported individuals, the situation remains fluid and uncertain. As both African nations and the U.S. continue to grapple with the complexities of immigration, the focus must remain on finding solutions that balance national security concerns with humanitarian considerations. Going forward, more collaborative efforts will be required from African governments, international organizations, and the U.S. to create policies that protect the rights of immigrants while addressing the challenges posed by illegal immigration. With the Biden administration potentially bringing a shift in U.S. immigration policy, there is hope for a more balanced approach that addresses both the concerns of African nations and the need for immigration reform. As these discussions unfold, the plight of African deportees will continue to be a significant issue in international relations, with wide-ranging implications for the future of U.S. Africa diplomacy. Shifting dynamics in U.S. Africa relations, a broader context. As the Trump administration's immigration policies continue to reverberate through African nations, these developments cannot be viewed in isolation. They are part of a broader geopolitical context that has seen shifts in U.S. Africa relations. Over the past decade, African countries have increasingly sought to diversify their international partnerships, reducing dependence on the U.S., and engaging with emerging powers such as China, Russia, and regional blocs like the African Union, AU. The U.S. has historically been a key player in African development, providing foreign aid, humanitarian assistance, and playing a critical role in conflict resolution and peacekeeping efforts. However, as the U.S. has refocused its immigration and security policies, African nations are beginning to assess the long-term consequences of their relationship with the U.S., especially when it comes to issues like deportation, visa restrictions, and refugee policies. The Trump administration's prioritization of immigration enforcement has coincided with a growing sense of frustration in Africa regarding U.S. foreign policy. The deportation of African nationals is just one example of a larger trend of perceived neglect or inconsistency in U.S. diplomacy. African leaders, particularly those who have historically maintained close ties with Washington, are now balancing their relationships with the U.S. against the backdrop of rising engagement from China and other global powers. The issue of deportations also impacts African diplomacy on the global stage. Countries like Somalia, Nigeria, and Kenya are increasingly advocating for more equitable treatment within international forums, including the United Nations, where issues of human rights and migration are frequently discussed. These countries have leveraged their position within the African Union to raise concerns over the U.S.'s treatment of their citizens, using diplomatic channels to call for reforms and for greater support in addressing the consequences of mass deportations. The human cost of deportation, stories from the ground. While the political and diplomatic dimensions of the deportation issue are significant, it is crucial not to overlook the human impact. The stories of individuals affected by these deportation policies provide a window into the personal toll of these decisions. Many deported Africans have spent years, if not decades, building lives in the U.S., only to face the uncertainty of returning to countries that may no longer feel like home. For instance, the case of Somali immigrants is particularly poignant. Many Somalis arrived in the U.S. as refugees fleeing decades of civil war, terrorism, and famine. Today, they represent a vibrant diaspora community contributing to various aspects of American society. However, the prospect of deportation not only threatens to unravel their personal lives but also raises concerns about the safety and well-being of their families upon their return. A similar situation exists for Nigerians, many of whom have sought better opportunities in the U.S. amidst political instability and economic hardship in their home country. Deportation is not simply about sending individuals back to their country. It often involves uprooting families, severing ties with established networks, and confronting challenges in reintegrating into a society that may have changed significantly since they left. The trauma of deportation is also felt by children of deportees, who may have been born in the U.S. and have never lived in their parents' home country. For these children, the prospect of relocation to a country with a different language, culture, and socioeconomic conditions can be especially difficult. Policy alternatives and the role of African governments. As the number of African nationals facing deportation continues to rise, it is essential for African governments to explore alternatives that could alleviate the pressures on their citizens. A concerted effort to negotiate with the U.S. for more humane policies could provide some relief for deportees, particularly those who pose no threat to national security. In the short term, African governments can increase their diplomatic engagement with the U.S. on issues related to deportation. This could involve lobbying for the expansion of TPS, temporary protected status, or advocating for the creation of new pathways to legal residency for long-term immigrants who have contributed to their communities in the U.S. There are precedents for such efforts. For instance, the Obama administration's DACA program, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, provided temporary relief to undocumented immigrants brought to the U.S. as children. Furthermore, African governments could work with international organizations to ensure that deportees are treated with dignity and respect upon their return. Organizations such as the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, and the International Organization for Migration, IOM, have been instrumental in supporting the safe return and reintegration of deported individuals. These organizations could help provide crucial support for African governments in managing the reintegration process, ensuring that deported individuals are not left to face economic and social challenges without assistance. However, the reality of mass deportations is such that African governments may struggle to meet the demands of reintegrating large numbers of returnees. In this context, the international community will need to play a larger role in addressing the root causes of migration, including conflict, political instability, and poverty. Development aid focused on addressing these issues could help reduce the flow of illegal immigration and reduce the pressure on both African governments and the U.S. The need for a comprehensive global migration framework. As the global migration crisis continues to unfold, it is increasingly clear that a more comprehensive and coordinated approach is needed. The U.S.'s current stance on immigration, particularly with regard to deportations, has raised serious questions about the effectiveness and humanity of national policies on migration. At the same time, African nations must also look inward, addressing the push factors that drive people to seek refuge abroad in the first place. A global migration framework that considers the economic, political, and social realities of both sending and receiving countries is essential. This framework should aim to balance national security concerns with humanitarian obligations and ensure that migrants are treated with dignity throughout the process. It should also prioritize solutions that allow for long-term stability, such as economic development initiatives and conflict resolution efforts in countries experiencing high levels of emigration. Africa, with its young and rapidly growing population, will continue to play a pivotal role in global migration trends. As African nations continue to face challenges related to political instability, economic hardship, and climate change, the continent's citizens will remain a key part of global migration patterns. It is imperative that African governments and international organizations work together to create solutions that address the root causes of migration while ensuring that migrants' rights are upheld. The ongoing debate surrounding U.S. immigration policy, particularly the mass deportation of African nationals, is a complex issue with far-reaching implications. It underscores the delicate balance that must be struck between national security concerns, humanitarian considerations, and the socio-economic realities faced by both sending and receiving countries. While African governments and the U.S. continue to negotiate and navigate these challenges, the need for a more compassionate and coordinated global migration framework remains critical. As African nations and their citizens continue to face the consequences of deportation policies, the international community must work together to find sustainable solutions that address the root causes of migration, promote the rights of migrants, and ensure that both sending and receiving countries can contribute to a more just and equitable migration system. The future of U.S. Africa relations will depend on the ability of both sides to engage in constructive dialogue and to develop policies that prioritize the well-being of individuals while addressing national security concerns. The role of African diasporas in shaping U.S. immigration policy. Another crucial aspect of the deportation issue is the role that African diasporas in the U.S. have in influencing both U.S. immigration policy and the relationship between African nations and the U.S. African immigrants have long been an integral part of U.S. society, contributing significantly to various sectors such as healthcare, education, technology, and entrepreneurship. Their growing influence in U.S. political, economic, and social spheres offers a unique opportunity to address the challenges posed by the deportation policies. In recent years, African diaspora communities have increasingly mobilized to advocate for immigrant rights and to push back against restrictive immigration policies. This includes lobbying Congress, engaging in grassroots activism, and participating in public demonstrations. The strength of the African diaspora's political voice has grown, especially in states with large immigrant populations such as Minnesota, California, and Texas. One example of the diaspora's influence is the formation of advocacy groups, such as the African Immigrant Coalition, which works to advance the interests of African immigrants in the U.S. These organizations engage in campaigns aimed at securing more favorable policies, including pathways to citizenship, protections for undocumented immigrants, and better treatment for deportees. African diaspora communities have also been instrumental in pushing for legislative reforms at the local and state levels. By leveraging their voting power and advocating for immigrant-friendly policies, these communities have been able to exert pressure on both U.S. lawmakers and local officials. For instance, several states and cities have implemented sanctuary policies that limit cooperation with federal immigration authorities, effectively shielding undocumented immigrants from deportation. However, the role of African diasporas is not limited to activism in the U.S. It also extends to their home countries. Many African leaders have recognized the potential of their diaspora populations to play a role in national development. In the context of deportations, African governments have begun to explore ways in which the diaspora can support reintegration efforts for deported individuals, particularly in terms of providing funding, business opportunities, and expertise. Public perception and media coverage of deportation policies. The public perception of the U.S. immigration crackdown, particularly its impact on African nationals, is shaped by various factors, including media coverage, political rhetoric, and personal experiences. In the U.S., the media has played a central role in framing the narrative around immigration enforcement, often portraying deportations as part of a broader effort to secure the nation's borders and uphold the rule of law. However, as the human stories of deported individuals become more widely known, the media narrative is beginning to shift. Increasingly, news outlets are focusing on the personal consequences of deportations, highlighting the families torn apart, the dangers faced by deportees upon their return to countries like Somalia and Nigeria, and the economic hardships that deported individuals face in their home countries. For example, media reports have featured interviews with Somali deportees who describe their harrowing experiences upon returning to a country still struggling with civil war and terrorism. Similarly, Nigerian deportees have shared stories of reintegrating into a society with limited job opportunities and high unemployment rates. These personal accounts have resonated with the broader American public and have added complexity to the immigration debate. Social media has also played a significant role in shaping public perception, particularly among younger generations. Platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram have become important spaces for African immigrants and their allies to organize, share stories, and advocate for policy change. Hashtags like Stop Deportation Stories and immigrant rights have gained traction, helping to raise awareness about the issue and mobilize support for reforms. In Africa, the media's coverage of U.S. immigration policies is similarly shaping public opinion. African news outlets and social media platforms are increasingly covering the issue of deportations, highlighting the diplomatic tensions between African governments and the U.S., as well as the impact on individual deportees. As African governments continue to advocate for their citizens, the role of the media in informing the public and fostering dialogue will be crucial. The long-term effects of mass deportations. As the Trump administration continues its immigration enforcement policies, the long-term effects of mass deportations on both the U.S. and African countries remain uncertain. In the U.S., the continued push for deportations could have lasting impacts on the economy, public services, and the social fabric of immigrant communities. While deportation is often justified on the grounds of national security, its broader societal costs are significant. In African countries, the reintegration of deported individuals could lead to increased social tensions and strain already overburdened systems. Many African nations already struggle with high unemployment rates, political instability, and poverty, and the sudden return of large numbers of deported citizens could exacerbate these issues. Without sufficient support systems in place, many deportees could find themselves facing poverty, lack of access to health care, and limited job prospects. The impact of deportations also goes beyond the immediate consequences for individuals. Mass deportations could contribute to broader societal shifts, including increased migration within Africa, as deportees seek better opportunities in other countries on the continent. This could place additional pressure on regional economies and governments, further complicating efforts to address the root causes of migration. Moreover, the potential for political instability in countries receiving large numbers of deportees cannot be overlooked. For example, in countries like Somalia, which is still recovering from decades of civil war and terrorism, the sudden return of thousands of deported nationals could pose challenges in terms of both security and governance. These individuals may find themselves in precarious situations, facing threats from militant groups or becoming targets for exploitation. The future of U.S. Africa immigration policy. Looking to the future, there are several possible scenarios for the evolution of U.S. Africa immigration policy. With the changing political landscape in the U.S., particularly as the country approaches another presidential election, the direction of immigration reform is uncertain. While the Trump administration's hardline stance on deportations has defined U.S. immigration policy in recent years, a new administration could potentially shift priorities and implement more lenient policies. For African governments, the future of their relationship with the U.S. will depend on their ability to engage diplomatically, advocate for their citizens, and find innovative solutions to the challenges posed by deportations. As the global migration crisis continues to evolve, there may be opportunities for African nations to strengthen their position in international forums, advocating for fairer and more compassionate immigration policies. Ultimately, the need for comprehensive immigration reform in the U.S. remains clear. The current system, which relies heavily on deportations and strict enforcement, is not sustainable in the long term. A more balanced approach is needed, one that considers the humanitarian needs of migrants, the economic contributions they make, and the long-term diplomatic and social consequences of immigration policies. The future of U.S.-Africa immigration relations will depend on the willingness of both sides to engage in open dialogue, build partnerships, and work towards policies that benefit both nations and their citizens. Whether through humanitarian aid, trade agreements, or collaborative immigration reform, the path forward must prioritize dignity, respect, and cooperation in addressing the challenges of migration and deportation. Addressing root causes of migration, a long-term solution. To create lasting change, addressing the root causes of migration is crucial. Many Africans who migrate to the U.S. do so due to factors such as political instability, economic hardship, and conflict in their home countries. As such, African governments and international organizations must work together to address these issues at the local level, helping to reduce the need for people to leave their countries in search of better opportunities abroad. For example, Somalia has faced decades of conflict, and many Somalis who sought refuge in the U.S. fled from instability and the threat of terrorism. Similarly, countries like Nigeria, Ethiopia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, have experienced significant political instability and economic challenges, which have led many of their citizens to migrate in search of safer, more stable environments. Addressing the root causes of these migrations, through efforts like conflict resolution, economic development, and education, can help reduce the pressure on both African countries, and host nations like the U.S. African governments can also play a key role by investing in their domestic economies, creating jobs, and improving infrastructure to offer citizens better opportunities at home. By focusing on sustainable development and addressing issues such as corruption, mismanagement, and poverty, African countries can reduce the factors that drive people to seek asylum or migrate illegally. Moreover, improving governance and the rule of law can create an environment in which citizens feel safe and supported. It is only by addressing the internal issues of governance and development that African countries can begin to stem the tide of migration to the U.S. and other Western nations. The role of international partnerships in migration management. As migration continues to shape global politics, the need for international collaboration on migration management becomes more urgent. The role of the U.S., African governments, and international organizations in managing migration effectively cannot be overstated. Multilateral agreements, such as the Global Compact for Migration, provide frameworks for countries to work together to ensure safe, orderly, and regular migration. In the case of African nations, international cooperation is necessary to provide both financial and technical support for reintegration programs. These programs should include economic support, job creation, and social integration services to help deported individuals reintegrate successfully into society. They also need to consider providing mental health support, especially for deportees who have been through traumatic experiences, such as escaping war or enduring prolonged separation from their families. African governments and international organizations like the United Nations, the International Organization for Migration, IOM, and the World Bank must come together to create strategies that balance the needs of countries of origin, host countries, and the migrants themselves. These efforts should involve shared responsibility, where the U.S. and African governments are part of a larger international effort to manage migration effectively and humanely. Additionally, regional cooperation between African countries can help alleviate some of the pressures associated with mass deportations. African regional organizations, such as the African Union, AU, can work to harmonize immigration policies and provide collective support to countries most affected by deportations. By coordinating migration management efforts and pooling resources, African nations can better address the challenges posed by deportations and migration in general. Public policy recommendations for addressing deportations. Given the challenges posed by deportation policies, there are several public policy recommendations that can help mitigate the negative impacts on both African deportees and the U.S. immigration system. First and foremost, U.S. immigration policy must incorporate a more nuanced approach to deportations, one that considers the individual circumstances of those being deported. Deportation should not be the default solution for every undocumented immigrant, particularly for those who have lived in the U.S. for years, established families, and contributed to society. A comprehensive review of U.S. immigration laws, with a focus on fairness and proportionality, would help ensure that deportation is used as a last resort, rather than as a blanket measure for all undocumented immigrants. Additionally, expanding temporary protected status, TPS, for individuals from conflict-ridden countries like Somalia, Nigeria, and others could provide relief to those facing deportation, allowing them to stay in the U.S. while their home countries stabilize. Furthermore, the U.S. could explore alternatives to detention, such as community-based monitoring programs, for immigrants awaiting deportation. This would help reduce the financial and social costs of detention while ensuring that individuals who are not a threat to public safety are not needlessly separated from their families. In addition to changes in U.S. immigration policy, African governments must ensure that their domestic policies align with the realities of migration. Policies aimed at improving the economic and social conditions of their citizens can reduce the push factors that drive people to migrate. Creating better opportunities for young people, addressing corruption, and ensuring access to quality education and healthcare will help build more stable and prosperous societies, which in turn can mitigate the desire to leave for better opportunities abroad. Potential reforms in U.S. immigration policy, a post-Trump era. The U.S. immigration policy landscape is likely to evolve following the Trump administration, especially as the country faces mounting challenges related to immigration reform. With the next presidential election approaching, there are growing calls for a comprehensive immigration overhaul that balances national security concerns with the humane treatment of immigrants. A potential Biden administration, or any future administration, will likely face significant pressure to review the immigration policies set during the Trump years. The introduction of legislative reforms aimed at providing pathways to citizenship for undocumented immigrants, particularly those who have contributed to the U.S. economy, may be a key area of focus. Moreover, addressing the political discourse surrounding immigration will be essential for moving forward. Polarized debates over border security and immigration enforcement have hindered meaningful discussions on creating fairer policies for migrants. By promoting a more inclusive and humane approach, future U.S. administrations can help bridge the divide and create policies that reflect the complexities of migration and the contributions of immigrants. African solutions to migration challenges. As African nations continue to deal with the challenges posed by migration, it is vital for governments to look to regional solutions. Strengthening intra-African migration policies could create better pathways for citizens who seek to move within the continent. This could involve facilitating labor mobility, creating job opportunities in different regions, and supporting cross-border economic integration. A regional approach to migration could also help African governments better address the needs of deported individuals. By ensuring that deported citizens are reintegrated into the continent's economic and social fabric, African governments can create more resilient communities that reduce the need for migration to external countries. Furthermore, African countries could leverage their regional economic communities, such as the East African Community, EAC, or the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, to build more robust migration management systems. These systems would not only help manage migration flows within the region, but also allow African countries to address the broader socio-economic factors that lead to migration in the first place. The issue of deportations, particularly those affecting African nationals, is an ongoing challenge that requires a multifaceted response. While the U.S. government focuses on immigration enforcement, the situation has far-reaching consequences for both the U.S. and African nations. The human cost, economic impact, and diplomatic tensions must be carefully considered as both sides work toward solutions that prioritize fairness, dignity, and security. African governments, diasporas, and international organizations must work together to address the root causes of migration, strengthen regional cooperation, and advocate for more humane immigration policies. Through a combination of diplomatic efforts, domestic reforms, and international partnerships, it is possible to create a migration system that benefits all parties involved, one that upholds human rights, fosters economic development, and promotes global stability. As the world continues to grapple with migration challenges, the need for coordinated, compassionate solutions has never been more urgent. By focusing on long-term strategies and collaborative efforts, the U.S., African nations, and international organizations can work toward creating a migration system that serves the best interests of all, ensuring that migration remains a force for good rather than a source of division and conflict. The role of technology in managing migration. As the migration crisis continues to unfold, technology is becoming an increasingly important tool in managing migration flows, both for the U.S. and African nations. The integration of advanced technologies such as data analytics, artificial intelligence, AI, and blockchain could revolutionize the way immigration and deportation processes are handled, ensuring more efficient and transparent systems. In the U.S., the use of AI and machine learning could streamline the deportation process by improving the identification and verification of undocumented immigrants. With better data collection and analysis, authorities could prioritize cases based on risk assessments and avoid deporting individuals who pose no threat to national security. Additionally, AI could be used to expedite legal proceedings, reducing the backlog of cases in immigration courts and ensuring that due process is upheld. For African countries, technology could play a crucial role in managing the reintegration of deported individuals. Digital platforms could be used to track and support deportees as they return to their home countries, providing them with access to job opportunities, educational programs, and mental health services. Furthermore, technology could help bridge the gap between African nations and international organizations by enabling better coordination and communication, allowing for faster responses to the needs of deported individuals. Blockchain technology offers a potential solution for securely storing migration-related data, ensuring that both immigrants and governments can access reliable information. By creating a decentralized and transparent system, blockchain could help reduce fraud and corruption in the immigration process, ensuring that deportees are treated fairly and that their rights are protected. The impact of climate change on migration. In addition to political instability and economic hardship, climate change is emerging as a key driver of migration, particularly in Africa. Rising temperatures, desertification, and extreme weather events, such as floods and droughts, are creating environmental conditions that force people to migrate in search of food, water, and shelter. The United Nations has predicted that by 2050, as many as 143 million people in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America could be displaced due to climate change. This phenomenon, often referred to as climate migration, could place even greater pressure on countries that already face high levels of migration, such as the U.S. and European nations. For African countries, climate change represents both an environmental and socio-economic challenge. Communities that rely on agriculture for their livelihoods are especially vulnerable to shifts in weather patterns. For example, countries in the Sahel region, such as Chad, Mali, and Niger, are already experiencing worsening droughts and desertification, which are pushing many people to migrate to urban centers or seek refuge in other countries. The migration caused by climate change adds another layer of complexity to the already challenging issue of deportation. Many individuals who are forced to migrate due to environmental factors may not fit traditional definitions of refugees or asylum seekers, yet they may face significant hardships if deported to countries that are also grappling with the impacts of climate change. To address this growing issue, African countries must prioritize climate-resilient strategies, including sustainable agricultural practices, renewable energy development, and water conservation efforts. In addition, international organizations and donor countries should increase their support for climate adaptation projects, particularly in areas most vulnerable to displacement. By mitigating the effects of climate change and addressing its root causes, African nations can help reduce the need for climate-induced migration, increasing tensions and potential for conflict. The growing number of deportations, combined with the socio-economic challenges faced by both the U.S. and African countries, has the potential to fuel tensions and conflict. The political discourse surrounding immigration is already a deeply divisive issue in many countries, and the deportation of large numbers of African nationals could exacerbate existing social tensions, both in the U.S. and in African nations. In the U.S., the narrative of illegal immigration has been heavily politicized, with many political leaders using it to galvanize support among their base. This has created an environment in which immigrants, particularly those from Africa and Latin America, are often viewed as a threat or burden on society. The continuation of mass deportations could further entrench negative stereotypes and discrimination, leading to increased social unrest. In African countries, the reintegration of deported individuals could also trigger social tensions, especially in communities that are already struggling with high levels of poverty and unemployment. Deportees may face resentment from local populations who perceive them as competition for limited resources, such as jobs and social services. In some cases, deportees may be seen as failures who were unable to succeed abroad, which could further isolate them from their communities. These tensions have the potential to escalate into conflict, particularly in countries that are already experiencing political instability. For example, in Somalia, where decades of civil war have left the country fragile, the sudden return of large numbers of deportees could fuel tensions between different clans and ethnic groups. Similarly, in countries like Nigeria, where ethnic and religious divides already exist, deportation policies could exacerbate internal conflicts and contribute to further fragmentation. The role of African civil society and advocacy groups. Considering these challenges, African civil society and advocacy groups have an important role to play in shaping the discourse around migration and deportation. These organizations can raise awareness about the human rights violations associated with deportations and push for reforms that prioritize the protection of deported individuals. One example of effective advocacy is the African Diaspora Network, which works to promote the rights and welfare of African immigrants in the U.S. This organization, along with others, has lobbied for legislative reforms and has provided support for deported individuals, helping them navigate the complexities of the immigration system. Civil society organizations in Africa are also crucial in advocating for better reintegration programs and raising awareness about the challenges that deportees face. By working with governments and international partners, these organizations can help ensure that deported individuals receive the support they need to rebuild their lives. In addition, African civil society can play a pivotal role in advocating for policy changes at the international level. By joining forces with global human rights organizations, African advocacy groups can help push for a more humane and fair global migration framework that addresses the needs of migrants and deportees while promoting the rights of vulnerable populations. The need for comprehensive immigration reform in the U.S. The current U.S. immigration system needs comprehensive reform. As the U.S. continues to grapple with the complexities of immigration, the existing system is failing to address the root causes of migration or the humanitarian needs of immigrants and deportees. A piecemeal approach, based on punitive measures like mass deportations, will only exacerbate the challenges faced by both the U.S. and African countries. Comprehensive immigration reform should prioritize the establishment of fair, transparent, and humane immigration processes that consider the complex realities of migration. This includes providing legal pathways for immigrants, particularly those who have contributed to society, while ensuring that the U.S. maintains its commitment to national security. Such reforms would also include provisions for the protection of refugees, asylum seekers, and vulnerable migrants who are fleeing conflict, persecution, and climate change. Policies that address the challenges faced by African immigrants, many of whom are fleeing situations of extreme hardship, will be essential in creating a more just and equitable immigration system. Moving toward a balanced and compassionate approach. As we look toward the future, immigration and deportation will remain central issues in U.S. Africa relations. The current trajectory, which emphasizes strict enforcement and mass deportations, risks perpetuating the social, economic, and humanitarian challenges faced by African nationals and their home countries. To move forward, both the U.S. and African nations must engage in honest, open dialogue to find solutions that balance the need for security with the protection of human rights. This includes rethinking current immigration policies, creating pathways for legal migration, addressing the root causes of migration, and ensuring that deported individuals are treated with dignity and respect. The international community also has a role to play in creating a fairer, more cooperative migration system, one that recognizes the complexities of global migration and works towards solutions that are in the best interests of all. By focusing on collaboration, compassion, and long-term strategies, we can move toward a more balanced and humane immigration system that benefits not just the U.S. and African nations, but the entire global community. The need for inclusive global migration solutions. To address the growing complexities of global migration, particularly between Africa and the U.S., it is essential to develop inclusive migration solutions that involve not just the countries directly involved, but also other global stakeholders. These solutions should focus on shared responsibility, ensuring that all nations, regardless of their role as a sending, receiving, or transit country, contribute to the management of migration in a way that respects human rights and promotes social stability. A global approach to migration must prioritize human dignity, focusing on creating safe and legal pathways for migration that are responsive to the causes of displacement, such as conflict, economic hardship, and climate change. Countries like the U.S., which are traditionally major destinations for migrants, must take a leadership role in advocating for international policies that protect migrants' rights, promote equitable economic development, and reduce the factors that push people to migrate in the first place. One critical aspect of this is ensuring that migration policies reflect the current realities of the global economy and international relations. While the world has become more interconnected, it is important to recognize that migration is not only driven by push factors, such as conflict or environmental disasters, but also by pull factors like job opportunities, family reunification, and educational advancement. Creating migration systems that respond to these complex drivers will require international cooperation and the willingness to recognize migration as an ongoing, evolving phenomenon. International organizations such as the United Nations, UN, the African Union, AU, and the European Union, EU, play essential roles in shaping these policies and can provide vital assistance in creating frameworks that allow for the smooth movement of people across borders. By working together, these organizations can create more effective global migration agreements that balance the interests of both migrants and the countries receiving them. Engaging the private sector in migration solutions. Beyond governments and international organizations, the private sector also has a role to play in addressing migration challenges. Global companies and multinational corporations have significant influence and can help shape migration dynamics by investing in regions that are major sources of migration. By contributing to local economic development through job creation, skills training, and infrastructure projects, the private sector can help reduce the economic factors that lead to migration. Corporate responsibility is also important in ensuring that migrants are treated fairly once they arrive in host countries. Many migrants, including those from African countries, often take low-wage, precarious jobs in industries such as agriculture, hospitality, and construction. It is crucial that these workers are given proper legal protections, fair wages, and access to basic services. Companies can also take the initiative to improve working conditions for migrant laborers and ensure they are treated with respect and dignity. In addition, the private sector can support reintegration programs for deported individuals. By creating employment opportunities for deportees, companies can play a significant role in helping individuals rebuild their lives. Furthermore, the private sector's engagement in sustainable practices can contribute to reducing the environmental factors that drive climate-induced migration. For example, investing in green technologies, renewable energy, and climate resilience can help mitigate the effects of climate change, providing communities with the means to thrive without resorting to migration. Strengthening education and awareness programs. In addressing the migration issue, education and awareness campaigns are essential for both migrants and host communities. Many African migrants may be unaware of the immigration laws and the risks involved in crossing borders without proper documentation. For those seeking to migrate, providing information about the legal pathways to migration, available work opportunities, and the potential dangers of illegal migration can help reduce the number of people attempting dangerous journeys or entering countries without proper authorization. For host communities, awareness programs that highlight the positive contributions of migrants can help counteract the stigma and negative stereotypes that often surround immigrant populations. These programs can foster greater understanding between migrants and local populations, reducing the likelihood of xenophobia and social tensions. Community-driven initiatives, including local dialogues and cultural exchange programs, can encourage positive interactions and promote integration. In addition, the education system in both sending and receiving countries plays a pivotal role in shaping the attitudes toward migration. By teaching the importance of diversity, empathy, and cultural understanding, education systems can help create a more inclusive environment for both migrants and their host societies. Education is also key in preparing young people for the opportunities and challenges of migration, whether it be through formal schooling or vocational training that equips them with the skills needed for success in a globalized world. The future of migration in Africa, a regional perspective. While the challenges of migration are often framed in the context of U.S. and Europe-based policies, African nations are also grappling with internal migration issues that deserve attention. Intra-African migration is a growing trend, with millions of Africans moving across borders within the continent in search of better economic opportunities, education, and safety. The African Union, AU, and regional economic communities such as ECOWAS and the East African Community, EAC, are crucial in creating a more cohesive and cooperative framework for managing migration within Africa. The African Union's Agenda 2063, which emphasizes economic integration, infrastructure development, and the free movement of people across the continent, offers a long-term vision for addressing internal migration. By facilitating the movement of workers, students, and entrepreneurs within Africa, these initiatives can reduce the economic disparities that drive people to seek migration outside the continent. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, which aims to create a single market for goods and services across the continent, also presents an opportunity to improve the economic conditions that influence migration patterns. Moreover, regional cooperation on migration can help manage the challenges of deportation from outside Africa. Countries in Africa can collaborate on developing shared reintegration strategies for returning deportees, helping them reintegrate into the workforce and society. Regional efforts can also address common challenges such as access to healthcare, housing, and education for deported individuals, ensuring that they are not left vulnerable once they return home. Reframing migration as a development opportunity. Rather than viewing migration purely as a problem to be solved, it is essential to reframe it as an opportunity for development. Migrants, particularly those who return to their home countries after being deported or leaving voluntarily, often bring valuable skills, experiences, and resources that can contribute to the development of their communities. In many cases, deported individuals are highly skilled and can reintegrate into the workforce quickly, given the right support. For African governments, creating an environment where returning migrants can contribute to the local economy is essential. This can include providing access to microfinance, supporting small businesses, and facilitating access to education and skills training programs. By empowering returning migrants and recognizing their potential to contribute to economic development, African governments can turn the challenges of migration into long-term opportunities for growth. Furthermore, remittances from African migrants abroad are an important source of income for many households and have become a significant driver of development in certain regions. Ensuring that migrant remittances are used effectively to fund development initiatives, such as infrastructure projects, healthcare, and education, can help reduce the economic pressures that lead to further migration. As African countries develop more robust strategies for harnessing the potential of migration, both for their own citizens and for the broader region, they can build more resilient economies and societies that reduce the need for migration driven by poverty and instability. This shift towards viewing migration as an opportunity, rather than solely a challenge, will help reshape the future of migration policy both in Africa and globally. Charting a path forward. As migration continues to shape the future of U.S. Africa relations, a holistic multi-stakeholder approach is necessary to address the complex issues at play. The challenges of mass deportations, human rights violations, and the economic impact of migration must be addressed through diplomatic efforts, legal reforms, and international collaboration. Governments, international organizations, civil society, and the private sector all have crucial roles to play in creating a fair and just global migration system that respects human rights, promotes economic development, and reduces the factors that drive migration. The U.S. and African nations must work together to reform immigration policies, improve diplomatic engagement, and strengthen cooperation on migration management. This includes creating fair and transparent systems, investing in development, and addressing the root causes of migration. By reframing migration as an opportunity for development and cooperation, both African nations and the U.S. can chart a path toward a more inclusive and sustainable future for migrants and host communities alike. Ultimately, the global migration system must evolve to reflect the interconnected world we live in, where the movement of people is an inherent part of human experience. By embracing compassion, dialogue, and shared responsibility, we can build a migration framework that benefits everyone, ensuring that migration becomes a force for positive change rather than division. Building resilient communities. Through migration. As migration continues to be a key factor in shaping the future of both sending and receiving countries, one of the most important considerations is building resilient communities that can thrive in the face of change. Whether migrants are moving within Africa, to the U.S., or to other parts of the world, it is essential to ensure that both migrant communities and host countries can adapt and grow through the migration process. In Africa, the development of resilient communities starts with creating local economies that offer better opportunities for young people, the most likely demographic to migrate in search of work and better living conditions. By focusing on youth entrepreneurship, expanding access to education, and encouraging innovation, African countries can provide alternatives to migration and retain their skilled workforce. Governments can work alongside non-governmental organizations, NGOs, to support initiatives that empower young people to stay in their home countries by creating attractive economic opportunities. For African diasporas, these individuals often have the potential to contribute positively to their home countries. Many migrants have acquired valuable skills, advanced education, and exposure to global networks that can be used to benefit their countries of origin. However, this potential often remains untapped, as many migrants are unable to contribute meaningfully due to lack of connection to their home country's economy or political structures. Building bridges between diaspora communities and African governments can lead to meaningful partnerships that bring the knowledge and financial resources of the diaspora to bear on local challenges, including job creation, education, and infrastructure development. The power of remittances in development. Remittances have become a significant driver of development, particularly in African countries. According to the World Bank, remittances sent by African migrants represent billions of dollars each year, surpassing official development aid in some countries. These funds help to improve the lives of individuals and families, providing for basic needs such as healthcare, education, and housing. They can also be invested in small businesses, creating local job opportunities and stimulating economic growth. While remittances are vital for sustaining families in Africa, there is an increasing need to direct these resources toward more impactful, large-scale development projects. One way to achieve this is by offering financial literacy programs and investment opportunities to both the recipients of remittances and those sending them. This would encourage the use of remittances for long-term economic development rather than short-term consumption. Governments and international organizations can also help by creating channels that allow for the easy and cost-effective transfer of funds. Currently, remittance transfers are often costly, with high transaction fees that eat into the money sent by migrants. Reducing these fees and improving financial infrastructure would enable a larger portion of the funds to reach the intended recipients, and ultimately benefit local communities. In addition, African governments can offer incentives to encourage the investment of remittances into the formal economy. For example, setting up tax incentives for remittance-receiving families to invest in local businesses or create savings plans would provide long-term benefits for communities. By integrating remittances into national development strategies, African nations can ensure that they are used not just to support families, but to drive national progress as well. Creating pathways for legal migration. One of the fundamental challenges in migration policy is the lack of accessible and legal pathways for migrants. In many cases, people are forced to migrate irregularly, putting them at risk of exploitation and abuse. Legal migration pathways should be expanded and diversified to allow migrants to enter and work in countries through regular channels, whether for economic, educational, or humanitarian reasons. For African migrants, the ability to migrate legally and safely would reduce the risks associated with irregular migration, such as human trafficking, exploitation, and deportation. Legal migration would also ensure that migrants are integrated into host societies in a more structured and secure manner, benefiting both the migrants and the communities they join. The establishment of work permits, study visas, and family reunification programs are just a few examples of how governments can create safe and legal migration opportunities. Additionally, countries can explore programs like seasonal labor visas that allow migrants to temporarily enter the labor force in sectors such as agriculture, construction, and hospitality. These programs could be especially beneficial in countries facing labor shortages in certain industries while ensuring that migrants are treated fairly and with dignity. Countries with a history of receiving migrants, such as the U.S., Canada, and European nations, should work with sending countries to create bilateral agreements that facilitate legal migration. These agreements could focus on issues like skills training, workforce integration, and the protection of migrant workers' rights. In doing so, both sending and receiving countries can ensure that migration is a positive force that benefits everyone involved, tackling xenophobia and promoting social integration. A major issue that arises with migration is the tension between migrant communities and local populations. Xenophobia, prejudice, and racism often arise when large numbers of migrants enter a country, especially if the host population feels economically or culturally threatened. This can manifest discrimination, violence, or the marginalization of migrant communities, further complicating the integration process. Addressing xenophobia requires both grassroots efforts and top-down policies that promote social cohesion. Local governments, civil society organizations, and community leaders can organize initiatives to foster dialogue between migrant communities and local populations. These initiatives can include cultural exchange programs, workshops on diversity and inclusion, and joint community projects that bring people together. Additionally, media campaigns can be a powerful tool to change public attitudes toward migrants by highlighting their contributions to society and emphasizing shared values. Governments also have a role to play in creating policies that promote the social integration of migrants. Access to social services, such as healthcare, education, and housing, should be extended to migrants on an equal footing with citizens. Ensuring that migrants can participate fully in society, both economically and socially, will contribute to greater stability and harmony. These policies should be accompanied by public education efforts that challenge stereotypes and provide accurate information about migration. Furthermore, local communities should be encouraged to view migration as an opportunity for cultural enrichment and economic development, rather than a threat. By emphasizing the value of diversity and the benefits that migrants bring, countries can build stronger, more inclusive societies. This is particularly important in Africa, where countries are increasingly becoming destinations for migrants from other parts of the continent. Leveraging African Union initiatives for migration management. The African Union, AU, plays a central role in shaping migration policies on the continent. Through initiatives like the African Migration Framework, the AU has called for greater cooperation between African countries in managing migration, protecting migrants' rights, and facilitating the free movement of people across the continent. The AU's Agenda 2063 highlights the importance of integration and economic cooperation between African countries, with a particular focus on enhancing intra-African migration. This initiative seeks to reduce barriers to mobility, creating a more fluid labor market and fostering the development of skills across the continent. By creating more open borders and promoting regional cooperation, the AU can help create more opportunities for Africans to migrate within their own continent, reducing the need to seek migration to external destinations. The African Union also encourages African governments to adopt policies that prioritize the protection of migrant workers, including ensuring their rights are upheld in both sending and receiving countries. The AU's commitment to protecting the rights of migrants can be strengthened through collaborations with international organizations such as the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, and the International Organization for Migration, IOM. By aligning regional efforts with international standards and agreements, the African Union can help create a migration system that is more coordinated, transparent, and beneficial for all African countries. This would reduce the dependency on external migration routes, encouraging more sustainable forms of mobility that promote regional economic growth and integration towards a unified approach to migration. As global migration continues to evolve, it is evident that a unified and collaborative approach is essential for addressing the challenges faced by both sending and receiving countries. For the U.S., African nations, and international organizations to effectively manage migration, they must work together to create systems that prioritize the protection of migrants' rights, promote economic development, and reduce the factors that drive people to migrate. The African Union, African governments, civil society organizations, the private sector, and international partners all have key roles to play in reshaping the global migration landscape. By focusing on human rights, social integration, economic development, and legal migration pathways, it is possible to create a migration framework that benefits everyone involved, one that supports migrants, host communities, and sending countries alike. Ultimately, the future of migration depends on the collective will of nations and communities to work together, overcome challenges, and build a more inclusive and resilient global society. By doing so, we can ensure that migration remains a positive force for change, bringing people closer together rather than dividing them. Enhancing the role of African governments in shaping migration policy. As migration patterns continue to evolve, African governments must play a central role in shaping and managing migration policies that can both benefit their citizens and ensure the continent's development. Given the rapid demographic changes in Africa, with a youthful population increasingly seeking opportunities both within and outside the continent, it is essential for African governments to be proactive in managing these movements. One way African governments can enhance their role in migration management is by strengthening national migration policies that align with regional and continental frameworks. The African Union's AU efforts to create a harmonized migration policy can only be successful if individual African countries develop robust national migration strategies. These strategies should focus on creating opportunities for young people through vocational training, skill-building programs, and education initiatives that can be aligned with regional labor markets. In addition, African governments must take the lead in negotiating migration agreements with countries of destination, particularly those in Europe, the U.S., and the Gulf states. These agreements should seek to ensure that African migrants are treated with dignity and respect, receive fair wages, and have access to the necessary legal protections. African governments could also explore opportunities for labor mobility agreements that allow for temporary migration and offer migrants the chance to return to their home countries with skills and savings to contribute to their communities. Moreover, African governments must work toward creating stable economies and social infrastructures that offer citizens a reason to stay and contribute locally. This can be achieved by reducing corruption, promoting good governance, and ensuring that economic growth is inclusive and equitable. When citizens have access to quality healthcare, education, and employment, they are less likely to feel the need to migrate for better opportunities. By investing in development, African governments can provide an alternative to the pressures of migration that push people to seek opportunities elsewhere. Integrating climate change adaptation into migration policy. As mentioned earlier, climate change is an increasingly significant factor in migration. Africa is disproportionately affected by the impacts of climate change, including extreme weather events, desertification, and rising sea levels. These environmental changes are forcing millions of people to migrate from rural areas to cities or across borders in search of livelihoods and safety. It is crucial for African governments to integrate climate change adaptation strategies into their migration policies. This can involve developing plans to manage internal migration flows caused by environmental factors, such as creating climate-resilient infrastructure in urban areas and improving water and food security in regions prone to droughts. Investments in climate-smart agriculture, renewable energy, and disaster risk reduction are essential for mitigating the impacts of climate change and reducing the need for environmental migration. In regions particularly affected by desertification, such as the Sahel, governments can implement land restoration projects that revitalize degraded land and create new economic opportunities for rural populations. Additionally, African governments should advocate for global climate action to secure financing for climate adaptation projects, ensuring that migration due to environmental factors does not lead to further destabilization or conflict. At the international level, Africa must continue to push for greater recognition of climate-induced migration. This includes ensuring that climate migrants are granted the necessary legal protections and support systems, both within Africa and in countries of destination. The establishment of policies that recognize climate-induced migration as a distinct category of displacement could help create more targeted and effective responses to those who are forced to move due to environmental factors. The importance of gender sensitivity in migration policy. Another crucial aspect that African governments and international organizations must address in migration management is gender sensitivity. Migration often impacts men and women differently, and women and children are particularly vulnerable to exploitation, trafficking, and violence during migration. Furthermore, women are often left behind when male family members migrate in search of work, creating economic and social challenges for them. African governments must ensure that migration policies take into account the specific needs and vulnerabilities of women and children. This includes providing protection from gender-based violence and human trafficking, as well as offering access to education, healthcare, and economic opportunities for migrant women. Gender-sensitive migration policies should also involve creating support systems for women who remain in home countries while their spouses or family members migrate. Programs that facilitate the empowerment of migrant women, both in their countries of origin and in countries of destination, are vital. By providing women with the skills and resources needed to navigate migration, African governments can help ensure that migration becomes an opportunity for empowerment rather than an experience marked by vulnerability and exploitation. Moreover, addressing the rights of migrant women involves ensuring that they have access to legal services, healthcare, and social services in both sending and receiving countries. Partnerships with international organizations, including UN Women and other advocacy groups, can help provide migrant women with the necessary resources and legal protections to ensure their safety and well-being throughout their migration journey. Increasing engagement with the private sector for migration solutions. As migration increasingly becomes a central issue of global policy, the private sector has an important role to play in providing innovative solutions. While governments and international organizations have traditionally been the key players in managing migration, the private sector can offer valuable support in both the integration of migrants and the provision of job opportunities. In many African countries, the private sector is already playing a critical role in creating jobs, building infrastructure, and fostering entrepreneurship. By working with governments, private companies can help create opportunities for migrants and host communities to prosper. For instance, multinational corporations can partner with African governments to create training programs for migrants, equipping them with the skills needed for formal employment in both sending and receiving countries. The private sector can also play a significant role in the reintegration process for deported migrants. Many deportees face significant challenges in reintegrating into their home countries, particularly when they lack job prospects or have limited skills. By partnering with local governments and NGOs, companies can provide the financial and technical support necessary for successful reintegration, such as job creation, vocational training, and access to microfinance. Furthermore, the private sector can contribute to addressing the economic drivers of migration by investing in developing economies, particularly in Africa. In regions where migration is driven by lack of economic opportunities, private companies can create new industries, provide employment, and help raise the standard of living. By promoting sustainable and inclusive development, the private sector can be an essential partner in reducing the pressures that lead people to migrate. Collaboration between migrants and local communities. Finally, fostering collaboration between migrants and host communities is vital for building inclusive societies. Migration should be viewed as a process of exchange rather than a one-sided movement. Migrants bring new skills, perspectives, and experiences that can enrich the host community while also benefiting from the opportunities provided by the local population. Programs that encourage cultural exchange, dialogue, and mutual understanding between migrants and locals can reduce xenophobia and promote peaceful coexistence. At the same time, migrants should be supported in their integration into local economies, societies, and educational systems. This includes providing language courses, cultural orientation, and legal support to help migrants navigate the complexities of life in a new country. African governments can also create policies that support the integration of migrants within the African continent, facilitating the free movement of people for work, education, and trade. This regional integration can foster greater collaboration between countries and reduce the need for migrants to seek opportunities in distant countries outside Africa. Toward a unified global approach to migration, as the global landscape of migration continues to evolve, a collaborative and comprehensive approach will be essential for managing the challenges and opportunities it presents. African governments, the U.S., international organizations, the private sector, and local communities all have important roles to play in shaping migration policies that benefit everyone involved. By prioritizing human rights, promoting economic development, and fostering social integration, we can create a migration system that is not only humane and just, but also sustainable and resilient in the face of future challenges. The future of migration will depend on the ability of governments, institutions, and communities to work together, to embrace diversity, and to provide solutions that empower migrants, strengthen host societies, and create long-term opportunities for growth and stability. Only by collaborating across borders and sectors can we ensure that migration remains a positive force for change, growth, and global solidarity. Addressing the challenges of forced migration and refugee situations. While much of the discourse on migration focuses on voluntary movement for economic opportunities or education, it is essential to acknowledge the significant number of migrants who are forced to flee their homes due to conflict, persecution, and human rights violations. Forced migration, which includes refugees and internally displaced persons, IDPs, is a pressing issue in Africa, with millions of individuals displaced due to ongoing conflicts in countries like South Sudan, the Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, and the Sahel region. African governments must take a proactive role in addressing the causes of forced migration, such as violent conflicts, political instability, and human rights abuses. While many African countries are already engaged in peacekeeping efforts and diplomatic mediation, more must be done to ensure that peace agreements are effectively implemented, that human rights are upheld, and that displaced populations are given the necessary support to rebuild their lives. Furthermore, African governments must work with international partners and humanitarian organizations to ensure the protection of refugees and IDPs. This includes providing shelter, healthcare, food, and education, as well as working toward durable solutions such as local integration, resettlement, and voluntary repatriation. The African Union has made efforts through its Common African Position on Humanitarian Action and its Agenda 2063 to address forced migration, but more resources and coordination are needed to tackle the root causes of displacement and ensure that affected populations receive the protection and support they deserve. Advice to African leaders. As Africa continues to face complex migration challenges, African leaders must embrace a more comprehensive and coordinated approach to migration management. This requires 1. Leadership in regional cooperation. African leaders must prioritize regional integration through frameworks such as the African Union's free movement protocols. This will allow for the smoother movement of people across the continent, creating economic opportunities and reducing the need for irregular migration outside the continent. 2. Investing in youth. Africa has the youngest population in the world, and this demographic shift presents both opportunities and challenges. African leaders should invest in education, skills training, and entrepreneurship to ensure that young people have viable opportunities in their home countries. By addressing the root causes of migration, such as lack of economic opportunities and conflict, Africa can reduce the pressure on its citizens to migrate in search of better lives abroad. 3. Embracing global partnerships. African leaders should strengthen diplomatic relations with the U.S., European countries, and other global powers to ensure that migration policies are fair and balanced. Bilateral and multilateral agreements must be in place to protect the rights of migrants, promote legal pathways for migration, and create frameworks that allow for the reintegration of deported individuals. 4. Promoting a culture of inclusion. African governments should encourage cultural understanding and inclusion for migrants, both within Africa and in countries that receive African migrants. This includes addressing xenophobia and ensuring that migrants are able to participate fully in society with access to healthcare, education, and employment opportunities. 5. Adapting to climate change. With climate change contributing to migration, African leaders must adopt proactive measures to mitigate its effects, including investments in climate resilience, sustainable agricultural practices, and disaster preparedness. These efforts will help reduce the need for environmental migration and create stable environments for communities to thrive. Summary of key messages. In conclusion, migration is a complex and multifaceted issue that requires a coordinated global approach. African governments, in collaboration with international partners, have a crucial role to play in managing migration in ways that prioritize human rights, foster economic development, and promote social integration. While the challenges of forced migration, climate change, and economic hardship are significant, they also present opportunities for growth, cooperation, and positive change. Key messages include 1. Migration should be viewed as an opportunity for economic growth and development, rather than a crisis. 2. African governments must invest in youth empowerment, education, and sustainable development to reduce the need for migration. 3. Coordinated regional policies are essential to address intra-African migration and create legal migration pathways. 4. International cooperation is necessary to ensure fair treatment and protection for migrants, refugees, and deported individuals. 5. Climate change adaptation should be integrated into migration policies to reduce forced migration caused by environmental factors. 6. Cultural inclusion and social integration should be prioritized to ensure that migrants are welcomed and supported in their host countries. African leaders must take a proactive, collaborative, and inclusive approach to migration, both within the continent and on the global stage. By addressing the underlying causes of migration, creating legal pathways, and ensuring the protection of migrants' rights, African leaders can help ensure that migration becomes a force for positive change that benefits both migrants and host communities. Thank you for watching The Bold African Voice, BAV. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more in-depth analysis on the latest issues affecting Africa and the world. Let us know your thoughts on this issue in the comments below. Stay informed, stay bold, and stay connected with The Bold African Voice.